In this video, I outline how governance worked within the Soviet Union. I'll start with just a couple caveats. While single-party states are really rare today, it used to be a common form of government, and every country handled it a little differently. I'm only trying to explain how the Soviet Union worked. I'm also focused here on the party apparatus and the bureaucracy. I'm not going to discuss the security services, even though of course they were important to the functioning of the state. So to begin by summarizing, just as a reminder, the Soviet Union did hold regular elections, but candidates from only one party were allowed to run. That is the single-party part of the single-party state. But what really characterizes the system is the size of the party, the size of the state, and their complete integration with each other. Party institutions were either created parallel to state organizations or fused with them. So, for example, there would be party representatives within the state ministries, like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the military. This is most famously where launching Soviet nuclear weapons required keys from both the local military commander and a party representative, the political officer. So these institutions were very hierarchical and were embedded everywhere. There were party youth organizations, related unions of all professions, writers, musicians, artists, etc. They were just everywhere. And they operated through a system of central planning. But I'll talk more about this in a moment. The organization of the Communist Party itself was complicated. To oversimplify, on paper, the most important organization was the Party Congress. This was a group that met every 5 years to approve the party program and membership of different committees. The Central Committee was selected from this group, and the leader of the Soviet Union was technically the General Secretary, also sometimes called the First Secretary or Premier, of the Central Committee. A smaller group of advisors, known as the Politburo, was selected separately to advise the General Secretary. Each of these organizations grew in size over time, with the Party Congress eventually having around 4,500 delegates, the Central Committee around 300 members, and the Politburo anywhere from 10 to 25 members. The USSR, that's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was formerly a federal state made of 15 constituent republics, and this party structure was duplicated within each republic, except Russia, which was run by the Federal Party. Within each republic, there were party committees from the neighborhood level to the city to the district, also known as oblast level. Just as an FYI, party membership was not something that was required of citizens. In fact, you had to be approved by a local committee to become a member, but it was considered politically advantageous. By 1986, there are some estimates that around 10% of the population were party members. I'm also skipping a discussion of the actual formal state institutions, including the elected legislatures. This was known as the Supreme Soviet, Soviet just being a Russian word for a committee. Like the federal nature of the Soviet state, these things did not matter until they did, in 1990 and 1991. We'll talk about them next week. So how did the bureaucracy actually work? First, a little vocabulary. The state bureaucracy was called the apparat, the state apparatus, and the people who worked in it were apparatchiks. These could be party officials or they could be regular bureaucrats, but this term generally took on a negative connotation similar to, functionary. The Communist Party at different levels did, however, have the authority to appoint around 1/3 of the positions in the apparat. The list of people who could be appointed to these positions was called the nomenklatura. This term tended to refer to the elite or well-connected within the system. The Soviet system generally, and the economy particularly, operated based on a system of central planning. The broad goals of the leadership would be set in 5-year plans, but the planning process operated on a continuing basis. The State Planning Commission, and Soviets loved their acronym, so this was abbreviated Gosplan, would gather data from state-owned companies and agricultural collectives on their inputs, their outputs, their capital needs, etc. They would collate this data and send it to the party, which would then decide on new targets. These could be really general, like, hey, stop doing mining, start doing plastics, or specific, like, increase your capital expenditures to 21%. But these targets would then be sent back to the heads of state enterprises who would need to implement them. Managers would receive bonuses for reaching targets and would be audited to ensure they were providing accurate information. So, spoiler alert, this did not work. Managers had few actual incentives to report accurate information. It was a particularly severe example of a principal-agent problem. And this combination of poor information and really unrealistic planning expectations led to frequent misallocation of resources. This in turn then led to everything from famine under Stalin to the routine shortages of consumer goods that the Soviet Union was famous for. Managers would need to rely on informal networks of suppliers to ensure they could meet production quotas, while consumers would have to rely on the black market for essential goods. Corruption was prevalent, although it was more petty corruption, such as bribes required to get a basic service or to turn a blind eye to an audit, rather than the grand corruption or grand larceny that we'll see nowadays. And this is one of the main legacies of the Soviet state today. The Soviet Union left its successor states a bureaucracy that was simultaneously huge. This was all companies, all hospitals, all schools, all ministries, everything, but also really weak. Since it operated largely through either party or informal channels, the state was actually ill-prepared to implement policies, and many of its employees were inculcated into a system that prioritized compliance over competence.